Have you ever wondered why you believe what you believe? Not where the idea came from, but what it's protecting. Because most beliefs aren't born from clarity. They're built in the dark, shaped by what the mind couldn't face. A defense disguised as a conclusion, a shield mistaken for truth. And the longer you cling to it, the more you forget what it's hiding. Stay with this, because what you believe about yourself might be the very thing that's keeping you from seeing who you actually are. We rarely question where our beliefs come from, not the surface-level opinions we revise over time, but the deeper convictions, the ones that feel woven into identity, the ones we defend without hesitation, even before fully understanding why. These are the beliefs that don't feel like beliefs at all. They feel like reality, but they didn't arrive through reason. They weren't constructed by logic or chosen from evidence. They were formed in moments of rupture, moments when the mind couldn't make sense of what was happening, but still needed to survive it. When a child is neglected, they don't analyze the parent's psychology. They internalize the neglect. They absorb the silence. They tell themselves, "This must be about me." And that becomes a belief, not a conscious one, an emotional one. I'm not worth loving. If I just behave better, maybe I'll be seen. People always leave. These are not philosophies. They are survival responses, frozen in place, never revisited. But the psyche can't live with chaos for long. So it turns these raw responses into structure. It weaves explanations around them, stories, worldviews, patterns, and slowly, almost invisibly, those old wounds become identity. That's how belief works. It organizes pain into meaning. It transforms trauma into a worldview. But because the belief soothed the wound, it becomes sacred. It becomes defended, not because it's right, but because it kept you from breaking. Carl Jung understood this. He saw belief not as a final destination, but as a defense, a psychological mechanism developed to keep the ego from collapsing. When the truth is too much to face, the mind invents a story that makes it livable. And if that story repeats long enough, it hardens into a belief. We don't just believe it, we become it. That's why questioning a belief can feel like violence. Not because the logic is weak, but because the belief was never about logic in the first place. It was about holding yourself together. So when someone challenges that belief, they're not threatening your idea. They're threatening your safety. They're touching the raw nerve the belief was built to protect. We like to think we are rational beings, that our convictions are the result of thoughtful exploration. But in reality, many of our deepest beliefs are just well-protected wounds. And Jung's question, the one he never stopped asking, is this: what would collapse in you if you stopped believing that? Because until that's answered, no belief is truly understood, only repeated, only clung to, only disguised. When someone speaks with absolute certainty, we assume they're confident. We assume they've thought it through. We assume they must be sure because their belief is strong. But Jung would suggest something else. Certainty is not proof of clarity. It's often a sign of what the person cannot afford to doubt. Because the stronger the emotional need, the stronger the defense. And the more rigid the defense, the more sacred the belief becomes. This is why people cling hardest to the beliefs that protect them most. Not just politically, not just religiously, but personally, in relationships, in love, in how they see themselves. Take a man who was humiliated early in life. He might adopt the belief that vulnerability is weakness, not because he examined it, but because it kept him from ever feeling that humiliation again. Now that belief is sacred. It structures his masculinity. It justifies his distance. It defends his emotional isolation as maturity. But it's not strength, it's protection. Another person, abandoned by someone they loved, might believe people always leave. This becomes the explanation for every new connection. They don't risk intimacy, not because they're cold, but because they've built a belief that makes distance feel safer than hope. Belief gives shape to fear. It gives language to helplessness. And the more pain it shields us from, the more fiercely we defend it. That's why we argue. That's why we moralize. That's why some people build entire identities around a single principle. Not because it opens them to the world, but because it keeps the world out. It's not that belief is bad. Belief is necessary. But when it's serving a defense function, when it's keeping you from feeling what actually hurts, it becomes a trap. You start filtering everything through that one idea, and anyone who challenges it becomes the enemy. Not because they're wrong, but because they're threatening the structure that holds you together. Jung called this a complex, a self-reinforcing emotional pattern rooted in an unresolved experience. The complex doesn't just distort your thoughts, it builds a whole worldview. You don't see it happening, because the belief feels like you. And that's the danger. The defense becomes invisible once it's mistaken for identity. Conviction, then, isn't always a sign of clarity. It can be a mask for fear, a performance of strength that hides the original wound. And unless it's questioned, it becomes permanent. You don't grow past it. You just keep proving it to yourself, over and over again, until one day the pain you've been avoiding finds another way to surface, and the belief you thought was protecting you starts to feel like the thing that's been holding you back. Carl Jung believed that what we repress does not disappear. It doesn't dissolve with time, and it doesn't lose power by being ignored. It simply descends into what he called the shadow. The shadow is everything we cannot admit about ourselves. Every instinct we disown, every fear we silence, every vulnerability we bury so deeply we forget it was ever there. But the shadow is not passive. It doesn't stay quiet. It reorganizes the psyche from below. And one of the ways it hides is through belief. When something in us feels too dangerous to face, too humiliating, too painful, too destabilizing, the ego doesn't integrate it. It constructs a belief around it, a belief that makes the discomfort easier to carry. This is the mind's self-protection. Not through repression alone, but through replacement. The raw truth is buried, and in its place, we install a belief, an ideology, a conviction. So instead of admitting, "I feel worthless," we believe only weak people need help. Instead of facing, "I was unloved," we believe love is a distraction. Instead of confronting, "I'm afraid of being seen," we believe, "I don't care what people think." The belief acts like a scar. It covers the wound, but it also numbs the feeling underneath it. And over time, the wound is forgotten, but the belief remains. Now it begins to shape identity, not consciously, but structurally. The belief becomes part of how you interpret the world. It filters your relationships. It colors your values. It forms your politics, your expectations, even your spiritual frameworks. But its foundation isn't truth. It's fear. It's defense. This is what Jung warned about, not just repression, but the systematization of repression. The way the shadow doesn't just sit in the corner of the mind, but seeps upward and gets mistaken for conviction. When enough of these beliefs accumulate, you don't just have ideas, you have a worldview, but that worldview is not built on discovery, it's built on avoidance. And that's the terrifying part. You can live an entire life defending something that was never true to begin with. Not because you're dishonest, but because you never knew what you were avoiding. The shadow doesn't announce itself. It camouflages. And belief, especially righteous, untouchable belief, is one of its favorite disguises. Jung didn't want people to be more certain. He wanted them to be more honest about what their certainty might be hiding. Because once the shadow becomes your structure, you no longer recognize yourself. You only recognize the mask that once kept you safe. Some beliefs stop making sense, but we keep holding onto them anyway. Not because they still work, but because they once did. They once gave us something we needed to survive. And even when they no longer serve us, we can't seem to let them go. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of psychological defense. It isn't the idea that matters. It's the role the idea played when we were weakest. The belief itself could be irrational, outdated, even self-destructive. But the moment it formed, it saved us. And deep down, the psyche remembers that. You might try to dismantle a belief through logic, reason, data, but none of it lands, because it was never about logic in the first place. It was about pain, and pain isn't erased by evidence. It's tethered to memory, emotional memory, to a time when that belief wasn't an idea. It was your only defense. That's why belief collapse feels violent, because to abandon the belief feels like abandoning the version of you who built it. That lonely child, that rejected teenager, that heartbroken man, that silenced girl, they aren't just part of your past. They're buried inside the belief itself, which means questioning the belief feels like betraying the self. So instead of facing that grief, we rationalize, we double down, we reframe the belief in fancier language. We wrap it in ideology, identity, even spiritualism, anything to avoid feeling what's underneath it. Jung understood that this is why so few people change. Because letting go of a belief doesn't just mean updating your worldview. It means confronting the emotional collapse it was built to prevent. You're not just losing an idea. You're losing the defense that kept you psychologically intact. And for many people, that loss feels like death. Not physical death, but ego death. The dissolution of the version of you that formed around the belief. And the ego will resist that with everything it has. It will argue, it will moralize, it will turn belief into identity, and identity into armor. Because the truth beneath it still feels too dangerous to face. This is why healing isn't just about insight, it's about grief. You have to mourn the self who built that belief. You have to mourn what they couldn't handle and what they had to believe to keep going. Until then, the belief will remain. Not because it's right, but because the pain hasn't been felt. And until the pain is felt, you'll keep calling the belief you. There's a moment in every real transformation when the floor falls out. It doesn't feel like insight. It doesn't feel like growth. It feels like death. Not literal death, but ego death. The slow unraveling of everything the mind built to protect itself. We tend to imagine transformation as a kind of arrival, a breakthrough, a sudden clarity that lifts us out of confusion, but the truth is far messier. Before the mind can reorganize itself, it has to let go of the structure that kept it intact. And if that structure was built around pain, if your beliefs were holding up the walls of your emotional house, then pulling one out is not a minor revision. It's collapse. This is why most people don't change through argument. They change through rupture. Something stops working. A relationship falls apart. A truth can no longer be denied. A moment finally arrives where the old belief, no matter how familiar, can't protect you anymore. That's when the collapse begins. You may feel lost, disoriented, even hollow, because the idea you were using to hold yourself together has broken, and the identity it supported begins to dissolve with it. This is the price of truth. Not more certainty, but less. Not becoming more of who you were, but realizing how much of you was constructed. Jung called this the nigredo, the blackening, a necessary descent into the unknown. The stage where the ego is stripped bare and what's left is not a stronger version of who you were, but the raw material for who you might become. But the mind resists this with everything it has. It clings to the familiar lie. It doubles down on performance. It floods you with anxiety and shame. Not because the truth is bad, but because the collapse feels like failure. You were taught to associate not knowing with weakness. But in reality, the collapse is the first sign of honesty. It's not proof that you've lost your way. It's proof that you've stopped lying to yourself. There's no clean path through this. You might feel unmoored, uncertain, emotionally exposed. You might not know what to believe anymore, or who you are without the belief that defined you. This is the psychological wilderness, the part no one prepares you for, and yet it's the only way through, because what comes after isn't a better mask. It's the self no longer organized around avoidance. But that clarity only comes if you stay in the collapse long enough to see what it was protecting. Most people retreat. They rebuild the old structure. They rename the same belief in different terms. But a rare few, walk forward, not toward certainty, but toward something more honest, a life no longer built on defense. There's a moment after the collapse, after the lie has crumbled, when you don't feel liberated. You feel disoriented, empty, like something vital has gone quiet, and you don't know if that's peace or paralysis. This is the part no one prepares you for. Not the breakdown, not the breakthrough, but the after, when the belief that once structured your identity is gone, and nothing has replaced it yet. You're no longer protecting yourself, but you're not sure who or what is left to protect. People think this moment should feel like clarity, like you've stripped away the noise and now the signal will come in clear, but it doesn't. What comes is silence. And for many, that silence feels unbearable, because when the belief is gone, so is the justification. The story that made the pain make sense, the identity that gave you shape, the defense that told you who you were, even if it was wrong. You don't know how to think anymore, not because you're lost, but because your thoughts were built around the thing you just let go of. And without that thing, your inner world goes quiet, not in a peaceful way, in an exposed way. You start noticing how often you used to argue in your head, how often you replayed imaginary conversations just to stay in control, how often you measured your worth against others just to feel real. All of that begins to fade, and what's left isn't confidence. It's stillness, not knowing, a kind of internal waiting. At first, this feels wrong. The ego wants to rebuild, to replace the old belief with a better one, a truer one, a more enlightened one. But something in you hesitates. You start to see how quickly your mind wants to escape discomfort by forming a new idea, a new identity, a new story that will feel safer than just being. And in catching that impulse, even for a moment, you begin to realize something. Maybe you don't need a belief to feel okay. Maybe you don't need to explain everything you feel. Maybe not every moment needs to be interpreted, defended, or understood. This is the beginning of something most people never reach. Not because it's unreachable, but because it's quiet. It doesn't come with fireworks. It doesn't announce itself. It comes in the form of a subtle shift. You stop gripping so tightly. You stop trying to prove your worth. You stop needing the world to reflect back a version of you that feels strong. And you start noticing what's underneath all that effort. You begin to feel, maybe for the first time, what it's like to be with yourself, without defending anything. Not perfect, not healed, but present. This is not the final transformation, but it is the turning point. Because once you can sit in that space, the space where belief used to live, and resist the urge to fill it, then you're no longer running, you're returning. You won't notice the shift at first. There's no dramatic moment, no blinding clarity, no inner voice declaring, now you're free. but something will feel different. You'll stop reaching for explanations, not because you know more, but because you finally don't need to know everything to feel safe. That's what defense always tried to do. Wrap the unknown in certainty, wrap the pain in language, wrap the past in meaning, but without those wrappings, without the shield of belief, you begin to move differently. Not because you've become someone new, but because you're no longer pretending to be someone you never were. You say less, but what you say has weight. You feel more, but it no longer overwhelms you. You see people, not as threats or saviors, but as reflections of their own unfinished stories. And most of all, you see yourself, not as an idea to defend, not as a project to fix, but as a person who survived long enough to stop surviving. There's no urgency now to define yourself. No need to take a side just to feel solid. No need to be right just to feel real. The world doesn't feel smaller. It feels wider, because you're no longer compressing everything through the lens of, what does this say about me? And in that space, that quiet space where belief used to sit like armor, something honest begins to grow. Not conviction, not ideology, not a new story to cling to, but presence. A presence that can hold complexity without collapsing, that can feel pain without turning it into philosophy, that can love without needing control. Jung never promised that this would make you happy. He never said it would be easy, but he believed and lived as though it were necessary. Because to stay armored is to stay divided. You can't defend and connect at the same time. You can't cling to your story and enter someone else's. Eventually, you'll meet a moment, a person, a loss, a mirror, where defense won't work anymore, where the belief will falter. And in that rupture, something will rise that feels strangely familiar. Not an idea, not a role. You, not the you shaped by pressure, by memory, by avoidance, but the one who was buried underneath all of it, quietly watching, patiently waiting to be lived, no longer believing, just being.